Hans, welcome to Constitutional Chats. We're so excited to have you here with us today. And we'd like to ask if you'll give us an overview of the Third Amendment, and then we will go to some questions.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me, and my congratulations to all the students out there who are taking the time to learn about the Constitution. One of my complaints, I think, is there are too many Americans these days who don't understand the Constitution, its provisions, or how important it is to maintaining the country that we have. So again, congratulations to all of you, and my admiration for what you're doing. The Third Amendment is one you just don't often hear talked about. You don't run across it, but at the time it was crucial. As you know, the Third Amendment says that no soldier can be, in time of peace, can be quartered in the house of any owner without that owner's permission, and in time of war only under particular laws passed by Congress. Now, again, today that might not seem important, but at the time it was crucial to the Constitution being ratified. The anti-federalists who didn't want ratification were complaining about the fact that one of the things that the British Crown had done, which so angered the colonists, was the quartering of British troops in people's homes. As you all recall, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty threw a little party in Boston Harbor in December of 1773 when they threw 342 casks of tea into the harbor to protest the Tea Act, which was imposing taxes on tea sold in America. This so angered the British Parliament that in 1774, they passed a series of acts called the Coercive or Intolerable Acts to punish Boston, and one of those was the Quartering Act. They obviously sent more troops to Boston, which they considered to be a trouble spot, and those troops were forced into the homes of individual homeowners throughout the city at a pittance, not actually paying what they cost to be quartered there. And that was something Americans really remembered. If you've read a op-ed that I wrote about this, you'll note that this was aimed at Boston, but actually folks in Delaware also threw a tea party after the Bostonians did, and they actually threw twice as many casks of tea into the water, yet it was Boston that was really targeted with this. What you have to understand about this amendment is that it really expressed the view of the founders of protecting the American people from a standing army, from the military. Why? Well, because obviously the British military had been used against the colonists when we were not a country, but simply a colony. The British Army was used for what we would today consider to be law enforcement, and going after groups like the Sons of Liberty. And the framers of the Constitution, particularly with the Bill of Rights, believed it was very important to prevent that. You can see that kind of balancing throughout the Constitution and other measures too. And keep in mind what the Third Amendment says: no quartering in time of peace, and in time of war only under laws outlining how it can be done by Congress. So you can see what the founders were doing was balancing private property rights with national emergencies like a state of war. You can see the same kind of thing in the Second Amendment. Again, the Third Amendment is to protect the American people from a standing army, while the Second Amendment certainly protects the ability to defend themselves, to be able to hunt. It ultimately is a defense against what could become a tyrannical government. So you see the same kind of idea behind the Second Amendment as you see in the Third Amendment. You can also see this, by the way, in a law that sometimes you'll see talked about called the Posse Comitatus Act. That's a law passed in the late 1800s that specifically bars the US military from being used for domestic law enforcement. So even if the FBI, for example, is having problems with crime in a particular city or a particular area, the president cannot order the 101st Airborne to go there to help them with domestic law enforcement. That is strictly prohibited. Now, obviously, this amendment has really never come into use because from the very start of our having a standing military, we have had Army bases where the troops live. So it's not ever really been an issue. It's hardly ever gotten to the courts. In fact, one of the only cases where it actually was used, and this is actually kind of, I think, amusing, was in 2001. Some folks in Colorado sued over a plan put in place by the governor and the state government to change the air traffic patterns in Colorado. What they were doing was opening up more space for the Air Force to practice military maneuvers. The government was sued over this, and one of the claims was that allowing these military flights over people's homes violated the Third Amendment. 10th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals called that argument frivolous, which is probably a good point. The only other time it's really been mentioned that I could find was, remember in 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the Second Amendment in a case involving the city of Chicago. In that case, the Supreme Court held that the Second Amendment is a personal right of citizens. And they did mention that the Third Amendment was one of the few amendments in the Bill of Rights that does not apply to the states, only the federal government, because it wasn't incorporated into applying to the states through the 14th Amendment. I think the only other thing I would mention is folks will sometimes say to me, well, if the military can't be used for domestic law enforcement, how is it that we sometimes see the National Guard called up, particularly in, for example, national emergencies like hurricanes? How were they called up for the fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan? Well, the National Guard really is the equivalent of state militias in the time that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were ratified. They are under the dual control of the governors of each state and the president, but under federal law, the president can only call up the National Guard of a state in times of war or national emergency. So again, you can see that even the statute regarding federal use of the National Guard is following the balancing act set out in the Third Amendment. So I'd be happy now to answer questions. This is a lot easier amendment to talk to than some of the other portions of the Bill of Rights, which come up all the time, including today in all kinds of different areas, particularly the First Amendment.
Well, thank you. That was a great overview and really interesting. I had noticed when I was doing some research for this show that the Third Amendment, is the Third Amendment the only amendment in the Bill of Rights that has not been applied to the states?
Yeah, the only really significant one, but all the other ones, the Second Amendment, the First Amendment, for example, which are very important, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, those are very important. They do apply to the states, as do others, such as the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, which prevent the government from being able to imprison you without a trial, or to, for example, search your homes without getting a warrant from a judge justifying a search warrant.
Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Tova because I know Tova has to get to class in a little bit. And so we want to make sure you get plenty of time to ask your questions. So Tova, I'm going to let you take it away.
Hey, Thank you so much, Kathy. This is a really interesting discussion. I love looking at amendments that don't get as much attention and really figuring out, why they're there and what impact they have for us. So I'm curious about this distinction between a time of war versus a time of peace. How is that distinction made? Like what shifts the legal basis of that?
Right.
If you could just explain that.
There are a lot of folks that have said that we can only be in a war and the president can only send troops to fight if Congress has declared war. But if you look at all of the combat situations that we've been in since the country started, you'll find that Congress only officially declared war in a very small instance of those. World War II, of course, being a prime example. There was no declaration of war during the Vietnam War when we had tens of thousands of troops fighting. For the fighting in Afghanistan, in Iraq, we also did not have a declaration of war, but what we did have was Congress passing bills that authorized armed forces and authorized the president to act and send those troops into combat. That is basically the equivalent of a declaration of war when Congress passes that kind of an authorization. Obviously, because look, while the president is the commander in chief, remember, it's the US Congress and particularly the House that has the sole authority for appropriations and budgeting. So if the Congress disagrees with what a president is doing, if Congress believes, for example, that a president should not be sending the 101st Airborne or the 82nd Airborne to fight in a particular place around the world, Congress can stop that very easily by simply passing a bill barring the funding of any such use of those troops in that area. So you don't have to have a declaration of war for the US to be involved in combat.
I see. Thank you. And where does this idea of having different powers in times of war versus times of peace, where does that come from? Is that in the Constitution, or was that an idea developed afterwards?
I'm sorry. What was that? What was the question
The
again?
concept of, increasing powers during times of war for the executive.
Well, you can see discussions of that amongst the framers and the founders of the Constitution, because clearly they understood that you didn't want to put yourself or the country in a situation where regular rules that should apply when we are at peace prevent you from protecting and defending the country in a time of war. And there was discussion of that, and even though the framers, of course, were very leery of a standing army because of what they had suffered from British troops when they were a colony, they put provisions in the Constitution, such as we discussed in the Third Amendment, to make it clear that there were times, particularly times of war, when emergency conditions warranted relaxing the usual limits on the power of the government. Those should be very rare. And I mean, a quick just example, if I could talk about it, is remember, during the COVID pandemic, all kinds of emergency powers were used by everyone from the president to mayors, school boards and others to take actions which under normal circumstances people would object to, everything like from closing schools to limiting restaurants from being able to do business. And there was a lot of litigation and a lot of vigorous debate over whether those leaders were going beyond their emergency powers and doing things that they really didn't have the authority to do. That is still being debated today.
Thank you. And then, you talked about this amendment from the perspective of, protecting Americans from the military in a way.
Right.
And I'm curious about how this idea connects to like how the Third Amendment connects to the idea of property rights. So could you talk about the connection between the Third Amendment and property rights, and then
Right.
in general, what it just seems to me that America tends to have very strong property rights. And that was like a value of the founding fathers. So if you could just discuss that concept a bit.
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, because I think what a lot of people don't fully understand is how important property rights are to a democratic republic, how important they are to protecting liberty and freedom. Yeah, it's important that we have a First Amendment right to practice our religious beliefs, to speak freely in all kinds of areas, including politics. But if the government has the ability to come in and simply seize your property, it makes some of those other rights look weak by comparison. Even if I can speak freely, but the government can take away everything I own, what kind of freedom is that? And so the founders understood that very well. And that's why there are very strong property rights in our Constitution. Of course, one of them, as you know, is while governments have the power of eminent domain, in other words, if they want to put in a public road, yeah, governments can seize property both at the federal level and the state level, but the Constitution specifically says they can't do that without compensating the property owner for the fair market value of that property. Similarly, remember the amendments that protect you in your home from invasive searches by the government and law enforcement specifically say the police just can't just show up at your door and come in because they think you might have committed a crime. They first have to go to a judge and present evidence to support that claim before they can get permission to come into your home. Those provisions, all of those, and many of them within the Bill of Rights and other parts of the Constitution, are protecting property rights because, again, the founders understood that that is the basis of a free society. If you doubt that, just look at places like Russia, the former Soviet Union, or China, where there really were no property rights. The government owned everything, and they had no system for protecting the individual property rights of any of their citizens.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then my last question is just concerning how the ideas of the Third Amendment connect to like eminent domain. Because that's just something that struck me, that like you can't have soldiers staying in your house, but if the government wants like the property enough, they can, there are avenues to still be able to like take it from you to use for government use. So I'm just curious the connection of those two ideas.
Yeah, there is a connection, but remember, the power of eminent domain is limited to public use. Most states also have provisions protecting that. So it's one thing if the government is going to come in and take your property, pay you the fair market value because they're going to build a public road, right? Or they're going to build a power plant because they're providing power to everyone. That's very different from, and not at all the same as, the government coming in, seizing your house, paying you the fair market value, but instead of using it for public use, selling it to some other private individual or private company to use for some other purpose. That, I think, goes far beyond the power of eminent domain and starts infringing on the personal property rights of individuals. And that's again where you have a balancing act between private property rights and the power of the government when it is working on behalf of the public in general and not to benefit another individual citizen.
Great. Thank you so much. I don't know if Jewel or Jordan are on to continue with the questioning, but I really appreciate you answering everything and being on today.
And good luck with classes.
Thank you.
So hi, Jewel and Jorn. I see you on, but are y'all ready to turn your camera on and ask a question, or would you like us to go to audience questions?
How about you go to audience questions just for another minute until I get set up?
Okay, that sounds great.
Thank you.
And before we go to the audience questions, we want to do a couple of things. First of all, we always like to recognize our students that are watching, and we've got some homeschool students watching today. Terry Zalesnak has several homeschool students watching, and Cami Waynouse and Kelly Sigmund. So we want to welcome all of our students who are watching today. And we want to take a minute to show everyone who's watching a great resource from the Heritage Foundation. Aubrey, are you at a point where you could pull up the Heritage Foundation's Guide to the Constitution website? Hans was just reminding us about this before we started the show today, and we wanted to make sure we always like to share great resources with our audience. And you can go on this Heritage Guide to the Constitution and click on any aspect of the Constitution, and they have essays that go with every aspect of it. Hans, is there anything you'd like to say about this?
Just, it really is a terrific resource because we take every clause and section within the Constitution, all the amendments, and you'll find a detailed explanation of why that provision was put in, what discussions there may have been by the founders about it, what was said about it in the Federalist Papers, and then interpretations of that provision in case law throughout our history, particularly if the Supreme Court has ruled on it. And those essays are written by some of the foremost constitutional law experts throughout the country. Right now, what we have up on our website is the second edition. And I will tell folks, we're actually in the midst right now of doing the third edition of the Heritage Guide to the Constitution. And we have constitutional experts all over the country who are updating these essays with the most recent court decisions, for example, by the Supreme Court that may interpret a particular section of the Constitution.
Oh, that's great. Well, we really appreciate you calling this to our attention and allowing us to share it with our listeners. And we'll get a link put to this in our Q&A trail as well. So now we've got several audience questions here. And let's start with Sarah Pilaquin, who asks, is there a militia apart from the National Guard? And is the National Guard constitutional?
I don't think there are any states that have militias that are apart from the National Guard. I think the National Guards today are essentially the state militias of 200 years ago, and that's why they are under the control of the governors in each state. Is it constitutional? Yeah, I don't think the way the National Guard is set up violates the Constitution, because again, the way it is set up, remember, if the president wants to use the National Guard, they have to get the permission of the governor. The only exceptions are in times of national emergency or in wartime. In wartime, the National Guard acts basically as a reserve component for the regular U.S. military, our regular standing army. And as you know, the National Guard is not full-time. The members of it, including members of my family, just do it part-time. So I think the way it's currently structured, it does seem to meet the provisions within our Constitution.
Well, thank you. And then Dr. Eric Braverman asks, does quartering apply to cyber invasion in any way? The ease of cyber invasion function as potential for foreign or other presence, a type of search and quartering in your work or homes. And
no, I don't. The cyber security is one of the biggest issues we face, as everyone knows. And I don't think that I don't think the Third Amendment applies to that. What does apply to that is, look, there's a very extensive federal statute that makes hacking and breaking into people's computer systems, including into government systems, makes it a federal crime. We constantly have problems, as you know, with foreign governments trying to penetrate the networks of not just the US government, the federal government, but also state governments and lots of corporations. The Chinese in particular have a well-developed unit actually within the Chinese army that engages in solely in trying to penetrate US systems, including going into companies for industrial espionage to basically steal our technology. All of those are crimes under federal law, and they are prosecuted with great vigor by the government when they can detect them.
Well, thank you. And then Dr. Braverman also asked, and this is not necessarily related to the Third Amendment, but it's a great question for any time, really. He asks, what is the legal basis to say democratic republic? Is democratic anywhere in the Constitution, the word democratic?
No, but you know, it's false to call us a democracy because we're not a democracy, as you know. A democracy is where the people simply make decisions on legislation without having representatives. When I say democratic republic, I use it in terms of the idea that, you know, democratic as an adjective means individuals having the ability to vote and choose their government. In our case, we're a republic since we choose our representatives at both the local, state, and even the federal level.
Well, thank you. And I think Jewel and Jorn, are y'all ready to ask a few questions?
Yes, we are. Sorry for being late on. Thank you for everything that you have shared with us so far. The Quartering Act is such a crazy act because I don't think any of us imagine any more troops being able to be stationed in our homes. And yet, of course, it's so important for the implications and explicit effects in our history and our law making history and legacy. So I have a weird question first, which is that, do you think that if there was not the quartering, that if this Third Amendment was not there, that the founders would have understood our government as having the ability to pass a quartering act? And this comes in the light of hearing that we didn't Bill of Rights because the government couldn't infringe on those rights based on the Constitution already.
No, I think that might have been a possibility. Remember, again, at the start of the country, the ratification after the Constitution, Americans were so leery of having a standing army because of the abuses they had seen with the British Army that the U.S. military was almost non-existent for a very long time. In fact, when the War of 1812 broke out, you know, we had almost no regular military troops. We had a very small number. John Adams had to call up state militias to try to help defend the country. And I could see in those early days, if the Third Amendment had not been there, I could see members of Congress potentially saying, well, we can save money by, instead of building military bases, you know, quartering them with troops, quartering private owners with troops in the areas where those troops are needed, particularly out on the frontier. I could see that potentially happening. So I think certainly early in our history, it was a necessity for the Third Amendment to be there. And particularly, like I said, putting the Third Amendment into the Bill of Rights was a requirement to get ratification done of the Constitution.
Now, another question that you may not get often, which would be that, what do you think of the argument that there would be a moral duty for citizens to house troops in times of necessity?
I guess I wouldn't buy that argument. I would think that you could make a very strong argument that if individual Americans want to volunteer to do that, kudos to them for being patriotic citizens, but for the government to force troops onto private homeowners, I just don't think that's something that Americans would agree is the right thing to do.
Now, we don't think very often, again, like I said before, we don't think of there being any need for soldiers to be quartered in our houses in modern day America. But can you think of any type of warfare? I know we had mentioned cyber warfare in one of the audience questions, but can you think of any modern reason where there may be some need for soldiers to be quartered in houses, or more likely that amendment may be interpreted to stop or just not allow something that would be more advantageous for the military to do in a time of war? And then this would be, of course, if war had reached our shores, or if it was some type of a proxy or cyber war.
No, I don't, I really don't see a situation where there would be a need for that, particularly if I give you a recent example. I mean, we have so many federal facilities in this country today. The federal government is a behemoth in comparison to what it used to be. And I don't know if a lot of folks realize this, but after January 6, 2021, as you know, there were National Guard units brought up to Washington from a number of states to be sure that there was no repeat of what had happened on January 6th. Again, I don't think a lot of people realize that. So there were National Guard troops all around Capitol Hill, which is where my office is located. There weren't enough facilities for these National Guard troops. I know that because I know folks who were in some of those units from various states, and many of them ended up setting up camp and sleeping in the underground parking garages that are underneath the U.S. Capitol and the office buildings, the Senate and House office buildings. And I think that was an example of, I just can't see a situation where the government would be so stretched and so short of resources that it would need to house troops in people's homes.
Do you think that this amendment would stretch to, like, let's say there was a technology that they wanted to put in, that they wanted to create like a cyber web, let's say, and they needed to put an antenna in every person's house, and they said it was for national defense. Do you think that would be able to get through in a way that maybe opponents of the Patriot Act think certain things and that were able to get through based on defense? And do you think that the amendment that blocks quartering would block something like that as well?
A good question, and I don't know the answer to that. Part of what the Supreme Court does is try to look at modern technology and apply these amendments by going back and seeing what it was that the founders intended to do with that. And a great example of that was a case not too long ago before the U.S. Supreme Court, in which the Supreme Court was looking at whether police could attach a GPS unit to someone's car that they suspected might be a criminal, such as a drug dealer, and track them using the cell phone tracking capabilities that we have these days. And the issue was, could they do that without a search warrant under the Fourth Amendment? Now, they had to interpret the Fourth Amendment based on the fact that, remember, there were no cell phones and no GPS units at the time of the framing and writing of the Constitution. But they were able to take the concepts of that amendment, and those concepts are very clear. The government should not be able to invade your personal property and search your personal property without probable cause and a judge authorizing them to go forward. And they applied that to this situation of modern technology. So what would happen in the situation you're describing is they would look at the Third Amendment and try to determine whether they believed it applied to this modern technology.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. And whenever there is another war, more modern war on a large scale, whatever innovations we'll see in weaponry and things, and what panic will ensue and attempts of the government in defense, and hopefully it'll be nothing that would call into question this amendment.
Right.
Although in my, what do you think is the greatest? What do you think the greatest legacy is of this amendment, which is so, something that's not litigated or referred to often, and something we don't see is going to be in the near future?
I think the biggest legacy of this amendment is something I talked about earlier, which is the thought behind it was to protect the American civilian population from a standing military army. And, Americans just take that for granted. I think many Americans just take that for granted. And that is not the rule in many other parts of the world. And in fact, is not the rule in the kind of dictatorships that exist in many parts of the world, where the military is consistently and constantly used against civilians to keep those governments in power. So I think it's just kind of part of that delineation, that structural delineation that the framers wanted and placed throughout the Constitution to keep the military separate from and without the ability to be used against the American people.
It's definitely a fascinating part of our history, and to understand how it, coming off the Boston Tea Party and just the emotions and thoughts of the American people, which would need a quartering act. And also, it's just so interesting to think about this thing, which is just so foreign to us, but really for much of human history wouldn't be foreign for soldiers to do anything like that, or anything that they wanted. And like you're saying, it's not just in history, it's actually other places around the world now.
And not to keep going on, but I don't know if you all have seen the reports that in Russia, they apparently are setting out press gangs to kidnap civilians right off the street, because Russian men are trying to avoid being drafted into the Russian army for this terrible war that the Russians are waging against Ukraine. And that is a prime example of the military being used against civilians.
For sure.
On that topic, do you think is it very common in other countries that the absence of a quartering act is really just used to keep those in power, give those in power a sustained strong hold over the citizens?
Well, the problem is in places like Russia and China is it doesn't matter that they don't have a constitutional provision like this, because even if they did, they wouldn't pay any attention to it. I can't remember who said this, but a famous, I think, historian or politician once said that if words were the only important thing, then the Soviet Union would have had the most wonderful constitution in the world. But it's not just having a constitution that's well written, it's having a people and a government that adhere to that constitution and all of the rights and liberties that it protects.
Has there ever been in our history someone in government who was strongly opposed to this amendment, maybe thought that it cut off our own nose when it came to a war in any circumstance, just in general? Has it ever been strongly opposed?
No, I'm not aware of that. Although, as you know, there are many other provisions of the Constitution that have been opposed, particularly starting with the progressive movement in the early 1900s, of which President Wilson was one of the proponents, who thought that the Constitution was outmoded and limited the ability of the government to make the kind of social and other changes that they wanted to make. So they didn't like many other provisions. That the Third Amendment was not one I think they paid attention to.
Just thinking about how to word my next question. But while I think about that wording, what is our most controversial amendment?
Oh, to me, it's no doubt it's the Second Amendment. You know,
Yeah.
there's
More
great
or less
opposition.
saw that one coming.
Yeah, no, there's great opposition to it. I think it's a very important amendment. Fortunately, the Supreme Court, as you know, within the last decade has finally applied it the way it was written, to say that it is a personal right. In fact, just recently in the last term of the Supreme Court, they had another important Second Amendment case before them, dealing with what they call concealed carry laws, this time out of the state of New York. And in that case, they held that the kind of restrictions that the state of New York was attempting to implement violated the Second Amendment.
Now, we could probably ask a couple more, but I know that we had a different pattern of questions here. So Kathy, do you want to get to any more audience questions, or should we ask some more?
Why don't you go ahead and wrap your questions up, and then if we have some time, we'll do a few more audience questions here at the end.
Okay. So was the third, now one more thing about this amendment was just the quartering of the troops. If there was a war between states, was that at all what the founders were thinking of, or was it really all about citizens' rights?
Well, it was about citizens' rights. I don't think the framers of the Constitution, particularly when the 13 colonies ratified it, it ever occurred to them that we would have a civil war in this country as we did, a very bloody civil war in which more Americans were killed and wounded than the total of all Americans killed and wounded in every other war we have ever fought. So what they were fearing was a federal military, a federal central government standing army being used against civilians. And I think they just weren't, it didn't occur to them that this might be a problem with the states. Why? Because state governments had militias. And what were militias? Militias were just civilians called up for specific duty under specific circumstances. They were not standing armies.
That's something I didn't think of exactly, and definitely interesting. Do you know, well, how about this? As far as the Quartering Act goes, being as it's something that, not the Quartering Act, being as the Third Amendment goes, being as it's something that we do learn about directly, coming from, so we learn about the Quartering Act, Boston Tea Party, as one of them in every, at least American history course worth its salt. It's something that is taken time on to understand. But do you think that there is that there's a lack of understanding? And if there is a lack of understanding about this part of American history, why would that be negative?
Well, no, I don't think anybody pays attention to the Third Amendment. I don't think professors and teachers, when they're talking about the Bill of Rights, spend any time on it at all. But again, that's because I don't think they understand everything that we have talked about how this amendment expressed the hostility of the framers to a standing army, and the risk that they saw that a standing army might be used against a civilian population. And the hostility wasn't there totally. They understood that you needed a military, particularly in times of war, if we were invaded or got into other disputes. So again, they wrote it in a balancing format to balance individual property rights with times of war. But I said, I think the average teacher probably doesn't understand that concept and how important it is to understanding other parts of the Constitution as we've discussed, because it's never, the Third Amendment has never had to be used in this country because Congress has never, ever done anything other than build military bases for housing our troops, and it's never occurred to them to force troops onto American property owners.
I just have one more question for you, and it's kind of a big idea question here, and it has to do with the impetus behind why we would need something like a Third Amendment. Our founders, and you've referenced this concept many times to protect the civilian rights, so there wasn't a dangerous standing army, and all of these things would be a way to protect against the state becoming tyrannical, but be a way to protect citizens from a hostile state. In all of human history, a hostile state is not an anomaly at all.
Right.
But the modern American, even being able to conceptualize a hostile state seems so foreign to our understanding, really, of anything, and to the point of being unimportant to an unreal fantasy. So would you like to say anything about that as my closing question?
Yeah, I think Americans have lived for so long in a very safe nation that, yeah, they don't have any concept that could possibly happen here. And I'm not saying it's going to happen here. What I'm saying is that I have the same view of history that the framers did. All of them were well aware. They were great historians. They knew what had happened to the Greek civilization. They knew what had happened to the Roman civilization. Rome started out as a republic. It turned into a dictatorial empire, and they were planning for the long term, the framers of the Constitution. And that's why they wrote it the way they did, to put in all kinds of checks and balances on the powers of the federal government and the powers of government in general against its citizens. So what I would say to people is that they need to remain eternally vigilant. That is the price of liberty. That's something that Thomas Jefferson, I believe, said, and he was absolutely right about that.
All right. Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Thank you, Joel and Jordan. Great questions and great questions from Tova. I think Tova had to leave us. Hans, we got time for just a couple more audience questions here. Dr. Braverman observes that U.S. military exceptionalism and restraint keeps the U.S. alive. He observes, he says 25 of the 39 signers of the Constitution were generals and veterans, but yet the ratification margin was slim. And he asked, do you agree that only Generals Hamilton, and Washington had a total plan to acquire state-by-state ratification? Do you believe military exceptionalism and restraint of Washington, financial of Hamilton, science of Franklin are linked in the U.S.?
Well, I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. I do think, though, that look, there's a reason George Washington was called the father of our country. He was so well respected by everyone. And remember, at the end of his 2 terms as president, a lot of folks were in the political realm were trying to persuade him to run again. And he specifically did not do that because he felt it was important to maintaining us as a free republic, that we not have presidents who stay in power for too long and accumulate more power. And remember, he established a tradition that you could only serve as 2 terms for president until Franklin Roosevelt broke that tradition. So I think that his support for the Constitution and eventually the Bill of Rights had a lot to do with persuading people to in the colonies to ratify it. But look, that was a matter of spirited debate in the state legislatures and conventions in some places that were considering whether the Constitution should be ratified. I do have to say, I don't know whether George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, or Alexander Hamilton would recognize the country we have become today, because we have a federal government today that is much more powerful than I think they ever envisioned it could become or should become.
Very true. We do wonder at Constituting America what the founding fathers would think of our country today, very often. Well, we would just want to thank you so much for being with us. I want to take the last 2 minutes here to just give a little preview of what we have coming up, because we covered so much ground today, and thank you for lending your expertise into so many different areas that even strayed a little bit from the Third Amendment. But, we talked about quite a bit about property rights. And next week, we're flipping our order to accommodate one of your colleagues, Cully Stimson's schedule. We really wanted Cully to do Fourth Amendment. He's so good on that. He's going to be talking about Fourth Amendment and new technologies, not next week, but the week after. So next week, we're going to be talking about the Fifth Amendment. And, I just had a little clause here from the Fifth Amendment that says, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So today was a great lead in to our discussion next week of the Fifth Amendment. We'll be talking about that. And when we were talking about earlier, those new technologies and having to reinterpret what the founders might have thought about certain technologies that didn't even exist in their day. Cully's going to be talking about that quite a bit, not next week, but the week after on the 4th. So we invite everybody to join us for our next episodes every Tuesday at 2 Eastern. And we want to thank you again, Hans, very much for your time and your wisdom being with us today. And I want to give Jill and Jorn just a second to say any parting words that y'all might want to give us for today.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. I'm sure you never thought you'd spend an hour with us getting to talk about the Third Amendment, but here it was. We had a wonderful guest.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all your knowledge with us. Appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing everybody next week. Thank you so much. Thank you, Hans.
Bye-bye.